You are listening to Latinx America, a podcast focused on highlighting catalysts who are using, leveraging, or creating technology to help our community achieve more. With your host, Adriana Flores Ragade. Our guest today is Jomayra Herrera. She works on the venture investing team at Emerson Collective, a social change organization dedicated to removing barriers to opportunity for everyone. Jomayra specializes in the organization's education technology, HR, and workforce investments. She spends most of her time identifying promising companies, driving the diligence process, and helping the team develop a point of view on particular parts of the market. Before joining Emerson Collective, she worked at a NedTech startup focused on transforming professional development opportunities for teachers. Jomayra was a 2018 Forbes 30 Under 30 winner in education. She received her MA in Education, Leadership, and BA in Political Science from Stanford University. Jomayra, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't we start by talking about your personal journey into tech, specifically education technology, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah. So my journey is an interesting one. When I started undergraduate school, I thought I was going to go to law school. That was always the plan. As a person that is first in their family to go to college, you basically are either a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer. Those are the choices that you want to go towards. And so I picked law school. As I spent more time volunteering in schools, working with kids, spending time at the Department of Education, I started to realize that the area that got me excited and the area that I was passionate about was education. So I ended up pursuing my graduate studies in education school, specifically focusing on instructional leaders and administrators and adult learning. So when I graduated, I ended up going to an ed tech startup that focused on professional development for teachers. And so it was right up my alley. My role was literally to work with administrators to help them rethink and redesign their professional development, leveraging technology to be more competency-based for their educators. And what's interesting is because folks ask me all the time, how did I end up in a venture role or a venture capital role? How did you plan for that? How did you know about venture capital? And I always say I never planned to end up in venture. That was not my goal. It was never even a career I knew about. It almost happened by accident. What I fell in love with was the problem that I was trying to solve, which was in education. And the tool that just happened to really align well with my own interests and skills happened to be in deploying venture capital. And so that's how I ended up now at Emerson Collective, where I focus specifically on our venture efforts as they relate to education technology. But it was never a path where I said, I'm going to end up in tech or I'm going to end up in venture or I'm going to end up in the type of role that I am in now. It was, there are issues that I care about very deeply, and I'm trying to figure out how can I best tackle those issues. And it just happened to be that it was in a technology related role and a venture related role.
What is your current role at Emerson Collective, and what is your organization trying to accomplish? Because you mentioned venture, but when one
Mhm.
thinks of Emerson Collective, there are different, I guess, arms within your own organization, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the role that I play, I sit at the intersection of our venture investing efforts and our education and workforce efforts. So basically, I focus on all of the investments that we make in the for-profit side that relate to education and to workforce. And so that's my primary focus at Emerson. But Emerson Collective as a whole, and the reason why I was attracted to it and excited to join was that the way we think about our work is we are singularly focused on reducing barriers to opportunity for all people. That's the mission of the work. And there are different ways to get there. There are a couple of key issue areas we focus on, including education, immigration, environment, health, and media. Those are the five big pillars. Um, but we also think about, in addition to the different issue areas, we also think about the different ways to actually tackle those issue areas. So venture capital is one piece, and I just happen to sit in that house, but we also do nonprofit grant making, we do policy and advocacy work. We, in some cases, actually incubate nonprofits within Emerson Collective and spin them out to operate under the Emerson umbrella, but someone independently. And XQ is a great example of a time that we did that. They focus on high school redesign. So in cases where we think that the solution doesn't exist and we can't deploy capital to catalyze that solution, we're willing to build it out, which is what happened with XQ. So we are really a multifunctional office, and we think that that is the best approach to drive change in any of these big issues. We don't think venture alone or grant making alone or policy alone is going to solve big problems that we're seeing in this space. We think it's more likely that the combination of those tools is what's actually going to drive change and ultimately help us get to that mission, which is reducing barriers to opportunity for all people.
Thank you, Yomaira. It's a very unique type of role because I've worked with foundations as a grantee. I worked in the nonprofit world for a number of years, and I think is this a new trend that you're seeing where there some foundations are moving more towards the both for profit and nonprofit investment, and I think it's very focused on like social type of ventures, right? Social entrepreneurship in a way.
Yeah, so I definitely think it is an emerging trend. And we have a lot of folks that we partner with and collaborate, like the Omidyar Network or Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which are similar family offices, but take a very similar approach to the work where they have multiple tools that they can use to drive change. Because I think the idea of relying on one tool everyone recognizes it's important and it plays an important role, but it stops you from really tackling the systemic issues um, that often act as barriers to driving change. And so I do see it as an emerging trend. It is a privilege to be able to do something like this. It's not something that's easy to do. It's also not something that anyone can kind of just get off the ground. But I definitely see it as an emerging trend, especially around family offices.
And also probably in this area, right? Where there's a lot of focus on entrepreneurship, innovation, and getting things, off the ground and moving. And speaking of entrepreneurship and in this space, what type of education technologies should we be excited about? You were working for an ed tech company. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did with your ed tech company to give our listeners an idea of what's out there, and then
Mhm.
also if you can share a little bit more about what you see as emerging ed tech, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So I'll start with the question on, what I did for the ed tech companies. So, like I mentioned, when I was hired, I was really focused on partnering with our customers to help them rethink and design what their professional development looks like. So, for folks that don't have the education background, basically professional development for teachers right now is a lot of sitting in a workshop for 6+ hours and hearing lectures and basically leaving from there and hoping that teachers really learn from that content. And we know that type of teaching and education doesn't work for our students. It also doesn't work for adults. And so the focus of the company that I was at was how do you switch that professional development to be from that sit and get to actually be competency based. And so my role was in helping administrators think through how to do that, especially leveraging our technology. And so that's what I started doing when I got into the company. But as you work in a startup, you learn that you do a little bit of everything, and whatever people need assistance with, you got to be ready to step up and help out. And so I did a little bit of work around thinking through some of our marketing strategies, our go-to-market strategies for different states as we were launching a new product line, and helped out in areas all across the board where folks needed assistance. And that's just kind of what it's like being at a startup. As you're building something, you're building the plane while flying it. And so I did a little bit of everything, but my role primarily was to work with our customers and helping them think through their professional development. In terms of your second question, which is around what ed tech companies should we be excited about, or what are the opportunities that are really interesting for leveraging technology to solve some of these issues within education that are interesting. And I think that for a while there was a rise of tools in education that tackled things like increasing student engagement and increasing kind of more kind of game-based solutions, but not tackling like the really hard problems that we see in education. And so I'm excited by solutions that tackle big problems, especially for underserved populations that are often missed out in education. And so one of the companies within our portfolio, Ellevation Education, for example, focuses on ELL students, which is a population of students that have largely been missed out when it comes to ed tech because folks don't really, as they're building their products and as they're building solutions, they don't think of this subset of the population. So Ellevation focuses on providing tools to the teachers and administrators of these ELL students to help support them in a personalized way on their growth. And so it's an example of tools and solutions like that that are really focused on populations that are often underserved by their institutions and often underserved by technologies that are out there. I think what's also interesting is solutions that help to address and amplify content areas that historically have not been focused on. So whenever you think about education, you think about reading, math, sometimes science. No one really talks a lot about social emotional learning. And so there is a rise of startups that are starting to focus on SEL or social emotional learning, whether it's on the assessment side or whether it's on the content side. And I think that's super interesting because what we know in a time of automation, the one thing that we do know is the skills that will never be obsolete are the very human skills, which are the social and emotional ones. And that means if you follow that logic, that those are the skills that we should be focusing on. We should be nurturing, we should be growing, and we should be developing. And so I'm excited about some of the potential there. Outside of K-12, there's also so much interesting that's happening in the workforce space and in the higher education space. We know higher education is deeply, deeply broken. It's very expensive, and the outcomes on the other end aren't always great for the vast majority of folks. And so there are a lot of interesting solutions that are happening there, whether it's from thinking about how do you really create that next generation university to how do you retrain the truck driver whose job is going to be automated, or how do you think about actually aligning the outcomes of a student and the incentives of an institution such that a student doesn't graduate with 150K in debt but doesn't have a job. So there's lots of interesting stuff that's happening across education, and also workforce and employment.
If someone wanted to follow the trends or what's happening, is there a resource where they can read more or something that you recommend?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that I look at on a daily or weekly basis, and together they help to really create a more comprehensive view of what's happening in the space generally. So EdSurge is a really good resource for just understanding what's happening broadly and at a high level in ed tech, and that's a newsletter that folks can sign up for free. And it comes, I think, on a weekly basis. And they have one that focuses on higher ed, one that focuses on K-12, one that focuses on innovation more specifically. And so that gives you a sense of some of the trends that are happening more broadly. And then beyond that, I tend to follow newsletters that talk about technology more broadly because that is like the other half of my work, right? Education is one piece and technology is the other piece. And so AXIOS, which is one of our portfolio companies, they have these incredible newsletters. There's a couple of them. One of them is called AXIOS Futures that focuses on what does the future look like, especially as it relates to technology over the next 10 to 20 years. So they talk a lot about the implications of automation, among many other things. And that comes every couple of days, and I find it super fascinating. They also have a newsletter called Pro Rata that talks about the latest deals in venture capital and just some of the emerging trends within venture. And so I think that to follow the trends, it's one, being able to follow the trends on the education side, and there are interesting newsletters and resources there. Ed Week is another resource there to follow, and then supplementing that with also the technology and the venture capital side, because it's the combination of those two that becomes super interesting.
Yeah, and it's changing our world, and it's changing the way I'm hoping that our classrooms and also most importantly, it's changing the outcomes for our students. Because at the end of the day, we, like you said, we don't want them to leave with $120,000 in debt and not be able to land a job because they'd have outdated skill sets. You have a very unique role where you are. How can others follow your footsteps? But before you answer, I want to let you know that I interviewed your friend, your high school friend, Maria Salamanca, and she recommended that we connect, and she connected us. And I just remember her speaking about, how you're making a big difference. So can you tell us how others can follow your footsteps and, maybe work at Emerson or maybe at a similar organization or at an ed tech?
Yeah. So a lot of folks ask me, I get this question a lot of how do I enter into a venture capital role, or how do I get into tech, or how do I get into X, Y, and Z things? And there are a couple of there are specific more tactical advice that I can give, but I think the one overwhelming thing that I find to be the most important piece is that what is really, really, really important to get into any field or any role that you're interested in is finding and figuring out what is your superpower. What is the thing that you are the best at? What is the thing that you are really good at, you're interested in, you're passionate about, and lean into that. The biggest mistake that I always see is that folks they try to be a generalist and try to be good at everything, and they just end up being okay at a lot of things, and that's not helpful to anyone, right? If you're hiring for someone for a venture role, or you're hiring for someone to work at, your ed tech company, you want them to be excellent at the thing you're hiring them for, not okay at a lot of different things. And so my biggest advice always is figure out what is that thing that just excites you, gets you out of bed, that you're really, really good at, and lean into it. And become that person that whenever I have a question about X, Y, or Z thing, like if what you're really excited about is automation in the economy, and you learn everything about it and you become that expert about it, and you become the person that I turn to ask any questions about it, whenever I think about a role, or whenever I think about a company, whenever I think about an opportunity that's related to that, you're going to be the first person I think about. And so people often forget that, is that you want to be the person that is top at the list for people when it comes to something. But if you're only okay, or you're only average on everything, you're not going to be on the top of anyone's list. And so I think that for me is the biggest piece of advice, is figure out what you're excited about and what you want to focus on, and really lean into it. And then beyond that, I think there are a lot of other pieces around. Make sure to build your network in a way that you are providing value to other people, other folks are providing value to you. Sometimes the ways that you get your job are through your networks, and that's hugely important. Do informational interviews, reach out to people. It's funny because a lot of people always tell me, I'm scared to reach out cold to someone. I don't have an introduction into them. And I'm like, what are you going to lose from reaching out cold to someone? If someone's interesting and you think that you have value to add and you want to learn from them, just reach out to them. The absolute worst thing that happens is that they don't respond. And that's fine. But you don't lose anything from that. And so I think there are ways to think about how to progress your career and how to get into where you want to be. Part of it is network, but I think it really ultimately comes down to figuring out what is that thing that is your superpower and just leaning into it.
So let me ask you, what is your superpower?
um, that's that's an interesting question. So I'll also know your super. I think you can have multiple superpowers, and I also think that they can change over time too. I think for me, one of the biggest things that, especially when I was first starting my career, was that I had this ability to connect very different industries and very different sides, very different perspectives that I think a lot of folks have a hard time sometimes navigating. And I can give more specific examples. I remember when I was interviewing for my first job, the person was looking at my resume and said, okay, so you've worked at a preschool, you've worked in investment banking, you've worked at the U.S. Department of Education, you worked at a law school. Like they were like, you worked at a senator's office, you have all of these different experiences. How does the same person that works at a preschool also work in investment banking? Like, how does that happen? And what was the superpower that I had was could be able to straddle these different worlds with different perspectives and different people and create that common understanding that sometimes is really helpful, especially when you're in a role. And so the role that I was applying for was a role where I had to bring together the technology world. I had to understand how that worked and also be able to sit down in a room with an educator or an administrator and talk in their language about how do you leverage technology in your space. And so knowing that I could understand both of those worlds and really lean into that instead of leaning out. I think some people are like, okay, well, I just need to be super technical. And super entrepreneurial. And that's what I need to focus on. And that's what I need to lean into. I think what I decided to lean into was actually, no, I can be part of both worlds and I can speak both languages. And that is helpful to this role and that's helpful to this company. And I continue to lean into that today and figure out ways to bring together different perspectives, bring together different groups that otherwise wouldn't be talking to each other. And so I think that's one of the ways that I think about my superpower. And I'm using air quotes because I don't want to, I have a hard time describing my own superpowers. But I think that's definitely one of them. And I'm continuing to think through how can I lean into more, especially as I grow as a professional and I grow in my own career. So right now I've been spending so much time learning about workforce and the future of work and trying to lean into that and have that develop that as one of my superpowers because I want to make sure, because it's an area that I care very deeply about. And I want to make sure that I can add the most value to that conversation as I can. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's interesting that you mentioned working with preschool students and working at the Senate. You communication. The communication is extremely important. So I
Hmm.
see that as one of your superpowers. So
Yeah.
um, let's move on to the entrepreneurial side. And if someone is interested in reaching out to you or reaching out to your organization wanting to do a pitch, what should they be thinking about? I know you mentioned earlier some of the things that you kind of look for, but
Hmm.
what are the steps?
What are So there are the steps of actually just getting into the door, and then there are steps of how you should think about pitching. And so I always tell everyone just folks focus on, oh, I have to get an introduction into you. I'm like, absolutely not. Just send me an email. It's Jomayra at emersoncollective.com. Spread it around. Just send me an email if you have a pitch, if you have an idea and you think it's good and it's going to help students or help people and really reduce barriers to opportunity. That's key. That only note I will make with that is do a little bit of research ahead of time to know the mission of the organization. So if you actually don't think that your company is focused on actually reducing barriers to opportunity or closing opportunity gaps, it's not going to be well aligned with us. We care about impact and we care about people and we care about reducing those barriers to opportunity. So that's key. And if you can find ways to show in that initial email that you send or that initial conversation that we have that there is alignment with then we can continue the conversation. So that's the only caveat I'll make on the cold email. But either find an introduction into someone in the organization or just send out a cold email or find us at an event to actually start that conversation. And then once we get into the room and we're at the level where you're doing that initial pitch, and then there are a couple of things I look for or that we look for. One is Are you someone that understands the space that you're operating so deeply that you can actually teach me, someone that has spent a lot of time in ed tech, you can teach me something new. You can teach me about your industry. Because one thing that I look for is what is the unfair advantage that this entrepreneur has, whether it's because of their network, whether it's because of their understanding of their space, whatever it is, what is the unfair advantage that they have? And so part of that is you just have a deep understanding of your industry and the space that you're operating in. I also look for someone that fundamentally understands the end user. And so in ed tech, that doesn't mean you have to be a teacher or have been a teacher, but that you have spent enough time with educators or whoever your end user is to really understand what are their true needs. Or you've created an executive team that helps to complement that understanding. And so that's another piece that I look for. And then there are there's obviously the piece around, is your product or is your solution actually driving impact in a meaningful way? And that's going to differ based off of what stage your company is at. If you're in a really early stage company and you just launched your product, you're probably not going to have a good sense of what the impact is. You might have some pre and post surveys, you might have some anecdotal case studies, but you haven't done a rigorous study yet. But some evidence or proof that your product or your solution is driving for change. And then beyond that, I think it's a lot of traditional things that other venture investors are looking for. Can you scale? Do you have product market fit? Can you sell your product? Do people actually want to pay for it? Because if
Mhm.
no one pays for it, you're not going to exist. And so folks always think that they're like, oh, well, you're an impact investor, and because you're an impact investor, you don't care about kind of scale or returns or financial sustainability. And I'm always like, absolutely not. We believe about impact at scale, right? Like if you can only serve 10 people with your solution, sure, you're having impact on those 10 people, but it's not at scale. It's not reaching m- large amounts of folks across the country or across the globe. So it's all about impact at scale. So it's a mixture of first ensuring that you're having the impacts that you want to have and really closing opportunity gaps. And then the second piece is more of the traditional metrics of making sure you can sell and you can scale in a way that's sustainable.
Thank you, Yomaida. You mentioned Ellevation earlier today.
Mhm.
Are there other companies that you funded um, that if someone is, interested in figuring out how they did it or maybe reaching out to them, that you can share with us?
Yeah, so other companies in our portfolio that I think are really another company in our portfolio that are indicative, I think, of our thesis around education. Another one is Panorama Education, which focuses on that social emotional learning piece that I was talking about. They are really focused on the assessment side of figuring out how do you make sure you know how a student is doing when it comes to their grit, when it comes to where they are in their social emotional learning skills, and then providing the resources and content that teachers need to help support that. And so Panorama Education is also another great example of a company that's doing fantastic work within our portfolio. On the higher ed side, another company in our portfolio is Udacity, which focuses on providing nano degrees at a much cheaper cost than going to a traditional university, so that folks can upskill on particular technical skills. And they have quite a bit of reach globally, so not just even in the U.S. They have a lot of reach globally, and they have a set of content that's completely free, and then obviously the nano degrees that folks can purchase if they're interested. But the whole idea is, how do you unbundle some of the content that is traditionally wrapped up in a 4-year or 2-year institution where you have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars? Is there a way to pay just a couple $100 and get a certification in particular skill that is directly related to employer demand?
Thank you. Let's go back to you. Where do you get your inspiration for the type of work that you do, both, at your current organization, but also outside? Because I was doing my research and I know that you're doing a lot of outside of your work. You're doing something in your hometown. So where do you get your inspiration?
Yeah, so I people have asked me, why do I do what I do, and I give them this really counterintuitive response that takes people, I think, a little bit aback. They ask me, "Why do I do what I do?" And I'm always like, "Well, I do it for myself. I do it for the kid that I was and how I grew up." And I'll give a little bit of context around that. So the big inflection point in my life was, like I mentioned, I got into school. I wanted to go to law school, and then I started volunteering around East Palo Alto. And I remember working with a student who he was a first grade student. English was not his first language. English was not my first language. He was in a school that was just underserved, did not have the resources they need to really support him. He didn't know his alphabet by first grade. He also was living in a home with multiple families and was growing up low income, similar to the way that I did. And so much of his story reminded me of the way that I grew up. And I think what blew my mind was that maybe 15 years plus had passed from when I was in his seat, and so little had changed in education. I mean, it was the same story repeated across the country because I grew up in Florida, across the country, and so little had changed. And it felt like there was no sense of urgency to actually change it in a meaningful way. And so when I think about my my work, it's how do you stop replicating the story that I lived through? Because I did not have an easy pathway through education. I got very lucky, and I ended up at Stanford, and I ended up where I am now. But when I think about my story, I am the exception to the rule. I'm not the rule. And and I see this story replicated all the time, and you get kids that sometimes get lucky and sometimes end up in good positions, but luck should not be what determines your success. Like, for me, that makes absolutely no sense. And so, but to answer your question, where I get my inspiration is, it's from the story that gets retold and retold and retold, and it's just a different name every time, and I want to end with that story. So it's pulling back to my own experiences, it's pulling back to experiences I've seen with students. And I try my best to spend as much time as I can now in schools because I don't want to feel disconnected from that either. And that's really where I get my inspiration from, because there's so much potential that's lost in students that don't get that luck, that lucky situation. And I think that that's something that for me is, it's almost, to a degree, it's almost unethical. It doesn't make sense. You're losing so much potential.
And much of that potential, unfortunately, ends up in being in communities of color.
Mhm.
So I'm just glad that you're out there fighting the good fight and also making us proud. And speaking of making us proud, you were recently named on Forbes list of 30 under 30 in education. How does that feel? And what's that experience like? You're famous.
It's so funny because I don't think about it very often. The only time I think about it is when someone brings it up. Um, because I found out about getting on the list the morning the list was released, when someone texted me and was like, "You're on this list." And I was like, "Wow, that's exciting and that's incredible." And my immediate reaction when I found out was, I called my parents and I told them. I didn't even It was funny, I didn't even say I'm on this list. I said I was just thanking them. And they were like, "Okay, for what? Like, why are you thanking me? It's like 6 in the morning. What's going on?" And I was like, uh, for me, I was like, "Thank you for all of the sacrifices that you've made. Thank you for everything that you've ever done for me, to even have this be an option." To even I would never have I didn't even know what Forbes was before I was 18, probably. Like, to even have this be an option, to have this be an opportunity, this is something that honestly I should give the credit to my parents more than I should give it to myself. Um so and since I got on the list, I mean, it's been great. It's been good to be on it. Folks reference it sometimes when I'm around. And but I don't think about it all the time. But it was what I think is good that has come from the list is that since being on the list, it gives you a level of amplification when it comes to using your voice. And so recently there was the Forbes Under 30 Summit where I sat on a panel that talked about the future of the workplace, specifically as it relates to women and how do you make it an inclusive workplace for women. And so being able to talk about issues like that I know that matter, having that opportunity comes largely from being able to be on a list like this, for example. So I think what's exciting about it is that it's an opportunity to use my voice, and to really leverage the platform that they provide through it.
Full disclosure, I found out of the 30 under 30 after I invited you. I invited you to be part of the show before before, okay? So I knew you then. Um, let's talk about reforms. What type of reforms or changes do you think need to happen for our community to become more involved in tech or careers of the future? And as you mentioned, stories keep repeating over and over again.
Mhm.
But how can we change the narrative for our community?
Yeah. Oh, there are so many changes that need to happen. I'm trying to think of where do I start? I think the fundamental one, and most people would agree with this, is you have to rethink how you fund schools. I mean, the way we fund schools is inherently inequitable as it's primarily related to property taxes. And so that's the fundamental thing, right? Change the way we fund schools such that folks that have the least amount of resources are the ones that are getting the most support because that's what they need in order to move forward. There are other things that I think are really important and need to happen, specifically related actually to mental health and wellness. I think it's some everyone talks about reading scores and getting math scores up and let's focus on the tests, and you forget about this whole mental health and wellness component to the work. And in my opinion, and actually, it's not even just my opinion. If you read the literature out there, and you read a lot of the research out there, if you don't address some of the mental health and wellness issues first, in not just community of color, it's anywhere. This is true for anyone.
Mhm.
If you aren't addressing those issues first, there is no place for learning. There's no space. There's no time. You can't actually learn. And so, how do you actually democratize access to mental health? I think is a huge fundamental thing. Because even if you solve the funding issue, all of a sudden kids have great access to learning resources, but they don't have basic support on the mental health side. The effects of childhood adversity and those experiences is so real when it comes to learning outcomes. And it's not something that has been elevated as much in terms of the conversation because I think mental health is still somewhat stigmatized. People don't really like to talk about it, but I think that's a way that when we talk a lot at Emerson, and I talk a lot about what are the high leverage points that if you invest in, you get huge catalytic returns. I think mental health and wellness is one of them. So I think that's one piece, and that's more on the K-12 side in terms of answering your question around pathways into tech or pathways into these jobs that we know are high paying jobs and that are probably going to be around in the future. It's so interesting how someone what I always find fascinating is how a kid in East Palo Alto, literally a mile from like in Silicon Valley, will not know about the tech careers that are available to them, will not know what venture capital is, will not know where they're sitting in terms of historically, in terms of Silicon Valley. That always blows my mind. So if that is true for a kid in East Palo Alto, think about a kid in the middle of the country. The access to information, access to role models, the access and role models specifically within tech, because I think there are tons of role models in communities of color and in low income communities, but specifically tech, access to role models in these careers, it's really hard to find. There are some interesting companies that are trying to do this. So in K-12, there's a company called Nepris that focuses on trying to connect virtually professionals in these careers into classrooms via video chat so that they can talk about their careers, they can talk about their pathways and their trajectory, because we know that it's hard to always find all of these role models in person and bring them all over the country. But how can you actually use and leverage technology to be able to do that? Because part of it is just an information gap. I think another piece of it too is trying. So you see a lot of these tech companies trying new diversity efforts, trying to bring in new diversity hires, et cetera. And part of there's two pieces to it. One is you have to actually believe that you belong in that space. So one of the most powerful stories that I remember a student was telling me was she did a summer program over when she was in high school that was related to STEM careers, and so she would go to this summer program every single summer for the entire summer and learn about STEM and take STEM classes and learn about STEM careers. And the first time she ever met a computer scientist was through this program, and that computer scientist happened to be a Latina like her. And
Mhm.
so she didn't realize that that was an exception until she got into Stanford, decided to major in computer science. And when she went to her first CS class, she looked around the room. She was the only Latina. Like there weren't other ones. And that was
Mhm.
the moment she realized she was the exception. But if you imagine if her first experience into computer science was that classroom, I would be willing to bet that she might not have gone to the point where she applied to Stanford and she majored in CS. And now she's in CS and now she's doing that and it's fantastic. But that first experience matters and having that sense of belongingness matters. So we have to think about how you can have those types of opportunity at scale. And then the second piece is once you get diverse folks into these tech companies, how do you think about inclusion and retention? Everyone is so focused on increasing the diversity numbers and getting the first female general partner, the first, Latina that did X, Y, and Z things, and that's awesome. But it's really hard to be the first, and it's really hard to be the only one. So, how do you actually focus on inclusion practices and retention? The Someone told me, and I'm trying to remember her name, but said something along the lines of diversity is a fact. Like it's just a fact. It exists. Like these are numbers. Inclusion is a practice and equity is
Mhm.
the goal. And so diversity is a fact. It's here. We live in a diverse world and we can create diverse spaces. But we have to think about inclusion in a really meaningful and intentional way. And we're ultimately driving towards equity, but we're very far from that right now.
I worked in college admissions at the beginning of my career, and that was a big thing for me. It's not you don't just bring these kids of color to your private, small liberal arts institution. You have to find a way that you keep them here for 4 years so they can graduate. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting, but it's not one or the other. It's you have to have an integrative approach to making this happen.
Yeah.
Um, we talked about your parents, and I know they were a big influence, but do you have other influencers that you follow? And why do you follow them? And why should we follow them too?
Oh, other influencers that I follow. That's interesting. So when I think of influencers, I think of like the celebrity Kardashian kind of influencer model.
I'm
but
thinking more of the techie
I
ones,
have
more of like the ones that would be appropriate for this podcast.
there are a lot of people that I find inspiring. There are a lot of people that I lean on in terms of mentorship and in terms of support. We talked a little bit about my parents. I think at the end of the day, they are the primary influencers of my life. That their sacrifices, honestly, like they are the folks. When I think of selflessness, they are my parents. When I think about what I am aspiring to, it's actually to the level and to the degree of selflessness and concern and care and humanity that my parents have. So they're the primary influencers in my life, and I will not ever deny that. Other folks that I lean on, honestly, a lot of it's not a lot of kind of like influencers. The people that I lean on the most and the people that inspire me the most and that push me forward the most often are my peers. So you interviewed my friend, my best friend Maria, and we came out to the West Coast together 8 years ago now, and from Florida, and she's been the person that I have leaned on, and we have supported each other, and we both entered venture capital at similar times. So that has been hugely important for my own growth and my own support. And then I've established a lot of peer circles and peer friends around me to push collectively ourselves forward. So there's a lot of I have a lot of friends that are just happen to be Latino. And we spend a lot of time together, and and whether it's in person or it's virtually or it's over text, we talk about the things that we're going through. And a lot of times there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of commonality, and and we're supportive and we help each other. And that, I think, is even it's more important than kind of like an influencer that you
Mhm.
follow more broadly. And then I've had the privilege of having tons of mentors in my life, whether it be in the workplace. I happen to work at a place that is incredible about thinking about professional development and mentorship and support, and outside of the workplace.
Thank you, Jomayra. Finally, what is your next play? What's in store for you in the future?
That's a loaded question.
That
you know,
is.
I'm taking it day by day and figuring out where are the places where my talents meet the needs of the world in really important ways. And I'm still in the process of figuring that out, because I think everyone has a responsibility to figure out what is their talent, what do they have to offer and to contribute to the world, and then matching that with what the world needs. And I think right now where I'm at, it's a good match and it's a good mix. I think there's still a lot of work left to be done when it comes to catalyzing innovation within education and workforce. And so I see myself still doing this for some time and figuring out new and better ways to make this more inclusive and more diverse and make it more really drive the impact forward. And then more generally thinking about how do you create spaces, additional space, so folks from my community that I grew up in and communities like mine to enter spaces like this and be more intentional about figuring out what that looks like. In the long term, I have no idea. I'll figure it out as I get through it. But right now I think there's a lot of work left to be done still where I'm at.
Great. And I appreciate the time you've taken to be with us today, the inspiration that you've given. I think you mentioned earlier that scaling impact is really important to you. Scaling impact is very important to me as well. And I hope that those that are listening to your story share it with others, and that we together change the narrative for our community, and continue to serve. So I look forward to continuing our conversation, and congratulations again on all of the achievements that you've been recognized for many of your achievements. And then last but not least, I hope that as you kind of think about your impact, that you take some time to sit back and understand what a difference you're making by amplifying the voices or giving a voice to the voiceless. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Y hasta pronto.
Thank you.
I recently saw Jomayra at the Latinx and Tech event hosted by the Caper Center, and it is evident how much she cares about advancing communities of color in tech. Speaking of advancement, let's move on to the key term of the episode, which is EdTech. According to the following definition provided by Investopedia.com, EdTech, or educational technology, refers to software designed to enhance teacher-led learning in classrooms and improve students' education outcomes. EdTech is in the early stages of development, but it shows promise as a method of customizing curriculum for a student's ability level by introducing and reinforcing new content at a pace that a student can handle. Once again, if you're interested in reading a full article, you can go to Investopedia.com, where they have a full article, and that's where I found this definition. Jomayra also mentioned that she started working for an edtech company at the beginning of her career, and as she mentioned during our conversation, she's now investing in edtech companies through her work at Emerson Collective. So feel free to reach out to her through social media if you're interested in this space. Finally, don't forget to rate our podcast in whatever platform you use to listen, and we hope that you are inspired. And please know that over the next couple of months, we're going to be releasing stories that we capture during the Kapoor Center's Latinx in Tech event. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Latinx America and on Twitter at America Latinx, or email any questions or ideas to latinxamerica@gmail.com. Gracias y hasta la próxima semana.